Jason here for Educational Renaissance. Today I'd love to talk to you about Bloom's taxonomy and the importance of objectives, or learning targets. And in particular, I'll unpack three blessings of Bloom's. You might remember that I've started a series where I'm going to ultimately propose that Aristotle's five intellectual virtues should replace Bloom's taxonomy in the cognitive domain. And one of the reasons I think that is because of our broader classical education critique of the modern era and how we focus too much on the head in education and lost this holistic sense of values and the importance of the heart and body in education. And I think that uniquely Aristotle's five intellectual virtues actually integrate head, heart, and body throughout some of them. So we're going to look at that, but before we dive in and propose, I suppose, what's wrong with Bloom's and analyze that in detail, I wanted to really make sure to appreciate the value of Bloom's taxonomy. They did something really great here when Bloom and his fellow university examiners came up with this list, drawing from just normal teachers' educational objectives. And so I want to think through that together with you today. What are the blessings of Bloom's? As we begin, I'd like to use the analogy of Alice in Wonderland. Perhaps you know the story or the part of the story where Alice is wandering about Wonderland and sees the Cheshire Cat and begins to ask him where she should go next. She doesn't know what to do, and the Cheshire Cat jokingly, I suppose, responds, "That depends a great deal on where you want to go." And Alice says, "I don't much care where, so long as I get somewhere." This idea of just getting somewhere, not much knowing or caring where we get to, I think is a good cipher or analogy for the case of many postmodern educators. And that's where, in our kind of listless meandering as teachers, not necessarily knowing what we're supposed to do or what the right thing is for one day or another, that's where Bloom's taxonomy and this modernist objectivism actually comes in and is a real savior to us. I think there are a lot of teachers, honestly, in our world that go about day by day just trying to get through, just trying to make sure that there aren't too many disciplinary situations and that somehow we covered curriculum by the end of the day. And I think that's actually a problem. It's more like Alice's listless wandering, and there's a reason why students haven't really been educated as well as they could be by the end of the day, by the end of the school year, by the end of their K through 12 educational life. So Bloom's objectives in the cognitive domain can kind of cut through all that ambiguity and give us something real tangible, give us a clear path forward. And so they're worth considering in detail. Again, as we try to fix where we went wrong, perhaps, with Bloom's taxonomy, we want to be careful that we diagnose the problem correctly, that we have a sense of where actually we went wrong on our path so that we can backtrack to there, take the right route, and actually be going the right direction. Because if we're wrong about that, then we'll just take another byway, or we'll pendulum swing from one error to the other, and I don't want us to do that. In our day of a postmodern retreat from overarching values and meta-narratives, it's actually having a clear path forward that I think is one of the most powerful and important things. So I want to stress the importance of having legitimate objectives or learning targets. This is something valuable that Bloom and his colleagues have bequeathed to us. So let me now unpack three different blessings of Bloom's as we assess the power of his educational taxonomy of objectives. So first, the first thing that Bloom's taxonomy does for us is it helps us avoid subjective and ideological learning activities. We need to avoid subjective and ideological learning activities. The great example of this comes from Doug Lemav's story of how he used to do his lesson planning when he was a novice teacher. And I'm getting this from his book, Teach Like a Champion 2.0, which Colby has interacted with a fair amount in a recent blog article series. He starts out by saying, when I started teaching, I would ask myself this question as I was lesson planning: what activity should my students do tomorrow? And then he goes on humorously to talk about the problems with that sort of question. The fact that he was planning for the next day implies a certain amount of procrastination, but then there's also the fact of starting with an activity rather than an objective, starting with what the students should do rather than what the purpose of a supposed activity is. I think this is something that the average teacher can struggle with a lot. It's so easy to get focused on all these activities that we're supposed to do, and in particular, in the modern educational world, there are particular activities that we know are good and we want to check all the boxes. Lemav also talks about the kind of ideological guidance that governs so many of our educational institutions, where if at least you're doing partner talk or getting technology incorporated in the classroom or any number of other things, then you're doing it well. And we can even have wrong views as teachers where what we think would be impressive to our fellow teachers, something really complex and artful in terms of a learning experience or set of experiences for the classroom, gains top notch in our view rather than what actually results in greater student learning. We can have a very entertaining show and series of experiences planned for students, but unless we can measure that they've actually changed and developed and grown in their ability in some ways, it may be all for naught. And that's exactly Doug Lemav's point, and I think the point of Bloom's taxonomy as well. We can have these subjective and ideological implied goals that we have where we're really just trying to check off the boxes for whatever ideology is ruling the day. And there are many fads, and we keep changing in our educational fads. But the most important thing is that students are actually learning. The question is not, did I teach this, but did students learn it? And I think we need to catch this vision of teachers as field experts and craftsmen, master craftsmen in this area who are accountable for results. There's something real and objective and strong about saying, well, we were accountable that students would grow in some particular way, and here we can show and think through the fact that they did. I love the quote from John Milton Gregory where he says that what a man does not know, he cannot teach. Or if he teaches, cannot know that he teaches. And I think this is really important to apply to us as teachers. Do we know something definite that we want our students to learn? Or do we have a definite goal that they will be able to do or accomplish this particular task by the end of our period, unit, course, whatever it may be? If we don't, we may just be wandering aimlessly in the dark, not knowing where we're going and not much caring where we're going, like Alice in Wonderland. So that's our first objective: avoid subjective and ideological learning activities. The second blessing of Bloom's is that objectives drive observable growth. They really do. Objectives help growth to happen. I love the story that Charles Duhigg tells of the origin of SMART goals in his book, Smarter, Faster, Better, The Transformative Power of Real Productivity. And he talks about where SMART goals actually came from. Two university psychologists, Edwin Locke and Gary Latham, did some of the first studies and research that showed the efficacy of SMART goals. And when one of the research studies that they did was with a whole bunch of typists at some of the best companies. And they picked out the typists that were already recognized as being better than those around them. And they gave them a method for measuring how many lines per minute or hour they could type effectively. And they started out at, I think it was 95 lines per hour. And they talked through with each of them just a 15-minute coaching session and had them basically set a SMART goal of some kind, something that was specific, measurable, attainable, was relevant to the actual craft, and was time-bound. And so they would maybe set 98 lines per hour as their goal for the next couple weeks or something like that. And what they found in their research was that when they came back, most of these, without doing anything other than just one 15-minute session with them, most of these typists had blown past their original goal, getting to 112 lines per minute or other things like that. And they thought to themselves, well, maybe it's just because they know we're here and are measuring it. Will this really make a discernible change for the long term? So they quietly kind of went away and came back a few months later to test them. And sure enough, all of them were still far exceeding their previous amount. And some had even gotten faster and faster at typing. The point here is that goals work. As Brian Johnson likes to say, we are teleological beings. And he's kind of referencing Aristotle here. We like targets. They help us feel like we're moving forward. They get our dopaminergic system going so that we know we're making progress in a particular direction. When you have clear goals too, they force you to think through and plan what would actually be most effective or best. And then encountering difficulties to come up with problem-solving solutions to them. I think this is what's really powerful about goals. I think teachers need to adopt goals and objectives that are measurable and specific and have a feedback loop in them where we can actually see if students are making progress or are understanding this or that concept and are being able to solve this or that problem. It's really important. We know from research that professionals or experts don't necessarily perform better than your average person. Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole, in their book Peak, The Secrets from the Science of Elite Performance, share that there's a lot of research out now that proves, in essence, that more years or experience in doing a particular profession or craft do not make you better when you're measured by objective results. And this goes for doctors and nurses. It includes psychologists. In some cases, even an average person could do better, or at least people who just came out of school, who just had their training, do better. So what does it take for us as teachers to really grow in our craft? And I think their idea of using objectives helps get us to deliberate practice, or at least purposeful practice. And that's the term from Anders Ericsson, one of the leading researchers on elite performance. What does it take to engage in the highest level of performance, to grow day by day, year by year in your craft? It's having objectives, clear objectives, and feedback to see whether you're getting there or not. So, objectives drive observable growth. That's our second blessing of Bloom's. Third and lastly is that objectives foster flow. Now, you may have been listening to this as a classical educator and been thinking to yourself, goodness, this is why I left the educational establishment, because of all the learning targets and the technicism and focus on techniques and quantitative measures, things that are measurable, when really education should be about transcendent values like truth, goodness, and beauty, the things you can't measure, communicating a love of learning and passing that on to my students. And so you may be thinking, how is this, all your Bloom's taxonomy and objectives talk, not just capitulating to that sort of factory model of education? And I'm deeply sympathetic with that. I've written articles on this sort of problem when we get overly fascinated with this sort of analysis. So hear me out. I think that we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. And there is some dirty bathwater associated with learning targets and lesson goals and lesson objectives. And I think that is mostly, though, associated with the kind of bureaucratic hoops that teachers end up having to jump through that are really more focused on, again, what I mentioned earlier, the ideological guidance, the technology you have to get into the classroom, or this or that thing that is a fad of today's educational establishment, and therefore we have to make sure all the teachers do this or that, rather than the real beating heart of a philosophy of education focused on students growing and developing and reaching their full potential. And so I understand the worries here, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Objectives are valuable, goals are valuable, and I think they're actually deeply classical. I talked about this craftsman mindset before, and that idea resonates with Aristotle's intellectual virtue of techne, or craft, artistry, or art. I believe teaching is a craft, and you have to work with reality to get the product that you're going for, right? There is a feedback loop and real objectives and goals that any craftsman has in order for them to grow in mastery. They have to, as Aristotle says, follow a true course of reasoning, where their rational faculty is interacting with the world around them as they use their body, their whole self, to create a valuable product for others. And we have a particular set of realities that we deal with in the classroom as teachers. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't set goals and objectives. There's actually a natural joy to doing this. This is why there are craftsmen, why there are games. When you set goals, you can get into the flow of the activity. You can focus your whole attention on really trying to improve and develop, and that's what's actually most enjoyable. I'm referencing here Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. He's a positive psychologist from this last generation here who showed through research that we aren't most happy when we're being passively entertained. People are most fulfilled and happy when they're engaging in a meaningful activity with their full attention and focus on it, when they have clear goals and clear feedback. That's when we're in flow. Do you want to be happy as a teacher? I think setting some measurable objectives will actually help you there, because you'll be able to focus on improving your craft as you interact with the real world of students, human beings who are very complex. And so there's something really important there that we need to keep. That doesn't mean, though, that we give up on all these untestable or hard to measure objectives and goals that we might have for our students. And that's what I'll be talking about next time, is how we do that. In particular, it makes me think of this quote by Galileo: measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. And I think there's a way that we can even work on those things that are really hard to measure and focus on those things and actually not lose qualitative values in our kind of SMART goal focus. But we can actually find ways, small ways, to measure whether we're taking good steps towards those transcendent values like truth, goodness, and beauty, and bringing our students up in the discipline and nurture of the Lord, the most important things that we're really about here. So those are our 3 blessings of Bloom's. Objectives help us avoid subjective and ideological learning activities. They also drive observable growth. We can see that from the more than 400 studies out there showing the value of SMART goals. And third, objectives foster flow. As a teacher, you will enjoy your life most if you have real baby steps that you can take day in and day out to help improve your students' learning. Thanks for this. Look forward to continuing to share more in this series on Bloom's taxonomy and how we can ultimately replace that with Aristotle's 5 intellectual virtues. Share your thoughts in the notes and comments.